This meeting we should be able to get through this in an hour. I think what we want to be able to do today, as reflected by the agenda, is we really want to review some of the work that Civilytics has done, and any questions we have from reading through the 18 pages for Jared. So we will call the meeting to order. Taking a roll call. So Karen Gardner here, Dorothy Savarese
Here.
Wendy Northcross
Here.
Dan Wolf
Here.
Kristen O'Malley
Here.
Sean Gonzalez
Here.
And Lisa.
and Lisa Guyon.
Here.
Okay, so everyone is here. Next on the agenda is the approval of regular meeting minutes from June 2nd, June 16th, and June 30th. I hear a motion to approve.
So move.
So moved.
Second. Wendy
And
second.
seconded. So we'll take a roll call on the meeting minutes. Karen Gardner,
Aye.
Dorothy Savarese,
Aye.
Wendy Northcross,
Aye.
Dan Wolf,
Aye.
Kristen O'Malley,
Aye.
Sean Gonzalez,
Aye.
Lisa Guyon.
Aye.
Okay, the meeting minutes have been approved.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
if I may, I'd just like to add a word of thanks to Robin for pulling together those minutes in such a detailed fashion. I just want to acknowledge that. So
Thank you,
I
Robin.
read over those drafts and had very little to add, so thank you.
No, the meeting minutes have been essential. So moving on to the next item on the agenda is a discussion of any ARPA questions we have. I don't think there were any from the last meeting.
None were received.
Okay. So unless there are any sort of ARPA sort of use related questions, we can move on to item 4, which is the bulk of today's discussion, the review and discussion of the Civilytics report, American Rescue Plan and other federal pandemic recovery funds. So I don't think Jared was planning on giving us sort of an overall summary this morning, but I kind of requested one at the last minute anyway. So I think the best format for this, I know you touched on this the last meeting, but just another overview, Jared, maybe some perspective on what other parts of the country might be doing with this, and then allowing us to ask questions would be a good way to sort of get our arms around this. We haven't cracked the code on a one-page graphic yet, but we're working on it. So I would hand it over to you, Jared.
Thanks. I'll just focus on the things that I think, the 4 or 5 things I think just the most important things when you hear ARPA, they should come right to the top of your mind so that as you're weighing these decisions, I think I'll try to organize it around those things that are the most important, because there's a lot of details and I'm happy to answer them. But I think some things that are important to recognize about it is that the municipalities, the county, and the state all have the ARPA money in their bank accounts right now, sitting in the bank account. So the money exists, it is tangible, can be drawn on, and it's very much present. The county, you all are working through a process to decide how to allocate that money. The state is not necessarily, it seems like it's on a bit of a pause. And that's a challenge for the county and the municipalities, because some share of the state money is going to be directed to projects across the state that would also, some of them would be in Barnstable County. You don't have necessarily a lot of control over the state timeline, of course, but it is a thing that you'll need to be able to monitor and pay attention to. And I think that's an important thing to then, if you're in the county, you think the municipalities are doing the same to the county. They're looking up at the county, and it's very clear that the municipalities want to wait and decide what to do until after the county does. So we're sort of all waiting to make a move. That's sort of the state in the Commonwealth. That's not true in other places across the country. Governments don't try to self-coordinate, and so there would be duplication in other places where the county and the state would do the same initiative or not talk to each other. But it seems like there is a lot of coordination in the Barnstable County realm, where people are at least paying attention to, not wanting to duplicate resources, not want to pay for something that another level of government is willing to pay for. I think the flip side of that is that December 31st, 2024 is when you'll need to certify that the money has been obligated. And that is starting every month to feel closer and closer. And thinking about the timeline that it takes to authorize a purchase, maybe a purchase of $2 million or that scale. Think about the paperwork that's involved in that. And the timeline is, I think, starting to become pretty critical. And I think the other confounding factor, which we spend a lot of time talking about, and I think is important, is the infrastructure law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I think muddied the waters on what should be done with ARPA money. So I think one thing to think about at a like very high level to keep them distinct is to think about the things that ARPA can do. Many of the things the infrastructure bill can do, but the infrastructure bill won't cover some things that ARPA could cover. So you've talked about these things, but I just think it's worth repeating them. Housing, public health, economic stimulus, education, and some of the broadband items that Sean has helped us see the difference between what's authorized and what the words say and what the actual impact could be for the amount of money that's listed. So there's opportunities using ARPA funds to impact those areas that the the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, bipartisan infrastructure bill, over the next 10 years won't really have an impact in those specific areas. It will have a big impact. And I think Barnstable County, it seems well positioned to capture the benefit of things like the water infrastructure, the roads infrastructure funding that is flowing through that. But that is also over a 10-year period, or 5 to 10 year period. And so, yeah, immediate needs could still be met with the ARPA money, or in the short term. There's nothing precluding spending the ARPA money on water infrastructure. Roads would be a bit of a trickier argument. So that's something to keep in mind. What it all adds up to, what my kind of thinking about what I would recommend to this group of very thoughtful people who are trying to make a tough decision, is that you should think about making the opposite of a rainy day fund, in the sense that we're not used to in public budgeting we think about rainy day funds a lot, but we don't think about what happens when a bunch of money is released all at once. And we have a short time period to push it out. I don't know, you could think of it as the haymaking fund, right? And when you make hay when the sun's shining. Well, the sun is going to be shining when Massachusetts finally decides how it's going to spend its surplus and its ARPA funds. The Commonwealth is going to push out a lot of programs, a lot of funding. And it is going to be up to entities like the municipalities and the counties to apply for, capture, advocate for those resources, and integrate them into some sort of combination with their local money that they're able to steer through the ARPA money. So that's what you all are engaged in. I just want to validate that I think is going to be critical for the next couple of years. And you'll need to have projects that can get going quickly, because the timeline a lot of the money isn't going to be on a timeline you can control, and the deadlines will feel tight. So I think that's a lot of the work of taking advantage of ARPA from where you are standing right now. And I think that sort of is a high level summary of the sort of information that the report says. In thinking about weighing decisions, I think those are the things that are important, but I'm happy to answer questions about specific details in the report, or specific provisions that you'd like me to clarify, or things that are going on that you'd like me to clarify.
Great, thanks, Jared. Appreciate that. So I think you gave us a good overall summary. So the 1.9 trillion most recently allocated from the federal government and ARPA, $1 trillion went to direct benefits to American families. 123 billion went to schools. 160 billion went directly to public health. So it's really this 350 billion that went to states, counties, municipalities, and school systems, where there's kind of people are waiting to see who goes first, right? Who's going to spend the first kind of money to see where they can most efficiently spend theirs. And I think we've been aware of that. So that is a good point to make. The timing issue is also, I think, a very really valid one. It does feel like these months are sort of ticking by a little bit, but so perhaps one of the recommendations this committee might consider is giving some guidance to the commissioners and to the counties on what a spend date would be that we might want to look at. I mean, if we crawl through some of the small grants, the grants program that we recommended last week, Vera did a great job putting together a potential timeline on that. That money, the process starts as soon as they approve it. That money really hits the street in the spring. The state money that appears to be that they're holding $1 billion plus for the next governor, because there's going to be a new governor. And so the state budget cycle and the local town budget cycles where they're doing larger infrastructure projects will happen next spring too. So we may want to consider maybe recommending a June 30th, 2023 date as sort of an allocation final spend date for the county. I see Wendy has a question.
Yeah, thanks. I just, I guess that whole idea that projects that have to get going quickly is, the money has to be obligated, but what if we run into, what if the county runs into supply or workforce choke points? As long as it's obligated and the project has been contracted, that's going to be okay?
Until 2026. Then the ARPA portion of the spending needs to be out of the bank account by December 31st of 2026. But if it's obligated by December 31st, you've got the contract, the project's going to start, but it's delayed. That's not a problem as long as it's not delayed past 2026.
Great question. Thanks, Wendy. Lisa.
I'm just wondering if there's any advocacy going on about extending some of these dates and deadlines that you know of.
There were multiple comments to the Treasury for the rule to extend it. Treasury declined to do that so far, but that they're not precluded from changing the deadline or changing the order of things, but they've said that they're not going to for now.
Great question. Thanks, Lisa. Are there any additional questions for Jared? I would just mention that I did have the opportunity to present sort of an update of what this committee has been working on to the Assembly of Delegates last week and to the commissioners this week. Both conversations, I think, went really well. So we're hopeful that we can begin to make these recommendations that formulate into ordinances and move through the process. One of the things that has come up recently pertains to funding the freshwater initiative and a discussion about whether that should be done through ARPA funds or through surplus funds. And the only thing I'll mention on that is that the county has the money for ARPA, that's in the bank. It also does have a significant surplus. So some of these issues about what's fundable and what's not, and the interaction with revolving loan funds, the county's got a great deal of flexibility on that. So if we sort of find something that we'd like to fund with ARPA, but maybe it's an investment in the septic loan trust fund to capitalize that. We don't think ARPA is a good fit, then the county does have the ability to sort of look at surplus funds if they have enough there. So I think that flexibility is important and should help us as we make recommendations to the county. But we'll wait. I think next week we would expect the Assembly to take action on the recommendations that we made to the commissioners based on the last meeting. Are there any additional questions? All right, seeing none, I want to thank you, Jared, for your participation. The committee today has been very helpful. And when we do get that graphic in shape, we want to run that by you and make sure that it's accurate. So
Yeah,
so
thank you all for letting me be part of this and for what you're doing, which I think is trying to make a bunch of good strategic decisions for the future of the county using the best available information and the restrictions of all the different funding sources. It's a big challenge, but this looks like a really great process, and I'm wishing you all the best of luck and success in the process.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, seeing no additional questions, it kind of brings us to the end of today's discussion, unless there is any potential unforeseen new business. I would sort of outline for the committee that we have the next 2 meetings we're looking at. We'll take up the 2 regional challenges that we prioritized at our last meeting. So the next meeting will be on housing. The one following that will be on water quality. And so we'll have to give some thought to how we want to sort of go about thinking about these issues. I know that we've had some discussions with Beth and with Vera. So there have been other members of the public that have been invited to our next meeting to participate in that housing discussion. And the same will happen with the water quality. But I keep going back to some of the comments that Dan made, I think at our first meeting on these larger kind of mega project issues, and trying to formulate recommendations that provide a roadmap, right? I think that was an important term used. So I would like us all to sort of think about that as we start to consider how we might approach these 2 bigger issues. In my discussions with the Assembly and the commissioners, if we take housing, for example, I think there's been a consensus among the committee that we should look at serving the homeless population as part of that discussion. There are certain components we can do there. There is an affordable housing piece to that discussion. How do we build more affordable housing? Is there a way we could structure a relationship with the state that would bring more money here? Is there a way that we could streamline the process for building affordable units? Maybe coming out of that is a discussion of approaching the state about taking a regional approach to 40B on the Cape. I think that our nitrogen issue sort of opens that up, but also if a regional approach would allow the 15 towns to share CPA funds, that might be another sort of approach to looking at that affordable housing segment. But the housing problem that we're seeing is it's a market-driven issue. And so it needs a market-driven response. We can't subsidize our way out of the housing situation. So we need to think about recommendations that we can make that might influence that. Zoning changes, I think, are the biggest example of things that towns could do that could create a market-driven counterbalance to some of the negative impacts we see from the housing situation that's changed so radically in the last 2 years. So I think we want to look at that. I also think we want to sort of call out workforce housing in particular, and look at some of those issues around there, especially as it relates to sort of the seasonal workforce and housing some of the foreign workers that we have here seasonally in the H-2B and the J-1 programs. So I just think if we look at that kind of housing layer cake, this is probably the discussion that we're going to have, and gives us a sense of the kind of recommendations that we could make that create a comprehensive housing strategy and potentially approach that kind of roadmap designation. Dan, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, Paul, thanks. And I don't think I'm going to suggest this in the form of a motion or take a vote, but I really would hope that we get a little bit more specificity when we talk about affordable housing, about what we're talking about. And, you know, we've kicked around the 30% of adjusted gross income of AGI as being a target. But I think we need to start looking at, you know, what do teachers make on Cape Cod? What do public safety people make on Cape Cod? What do hospitality workers make on Cape Cod? What do retail workers make on Cape Cod? Because I think rather than sort of be very general, you know, affordable housing, we need to start tying it to what the wages are and to who the people we're actually talking about are. Because I think that then it's a lot easier to make the case that, okay, you know, for a teacher average teacher salary on the Cape is, I'm going to take a wild ass guess, probably in the mid 50s. 30% of that, let's say, is $15,000 to $18,000 a year. Whether it's rental or whether it's figuring out how to get somebody into a house they own, that is a huge climb on Cape Cod. And so, you know, and the nonprofit world, which is so big on the Cape. I think last count we had, what, Wendy, 1,200 nonprofits on the Cape, or certainly it was over 900. So I would like to sort of drill down a little bit and say, here's the people we're talking about. Here's the incomes we're talking about. And unless somebody has a number different than 30% of AGI, I think that's sort of the number I'd like to see us focus on.
I think that those are great comments, Dan. So what we'll try to do is we'll try to have that information so we can start off the housing meeting with that kind of information, because I agree with you. Looking at sort of average salaries based on industry, sort of job descriptions, and then looking at sort of the top limits of qualifying for subsidized affordable housing, and then the income you'd need to get into the market, right? It creates this a really awful situation on the Cape now, where you could be in an affordable unit and be working to sort of further yourself and further your family economically. You're going to get to a point where you've succeeded enough that you have to move off Cape because you've fallen into that gap, right? So we'll try to get that information summarized and available for everyone to sort of consume before we begin the discussion on housing at our next meeting. Dorothy.
Thanks, Paul. I think just to amplify a little bit of Dan's point, but make one other, which is going to your layer cake of housing. I think I really believe that your point is so well taken, because if we identify the segments, we understand that each of them requires very different strategies. So when we mention the homeless, that requires a very different strategy. When we mention seasonal workers, very different strategy. LMI, different strategy because of the eligibility for income defined opportunities. And then Dan has introduced a layer that I think is essential, and didn't hear it, and so I'm glad he sort of framed it up, which is that workforce housing, which is, you know, really one of the major threats here. Defining that as well. So getting each of those so that we can actually have concomitant strategies makes a really, I think, makes a great deal of sense. And I had one other point and I forget what it is. So thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Wendy. You're on mute, Wendy, sorry.
I thought I must have clicked it back on. Sorry about that. So I think that one thing that I'd be interested, maybe, you know, the civilytics analysis can help us. So if we were to do a program as specific as, because I love the specifics, because now we can get into like the real meat of it. So what if we did interest rate buy down programs? Can we do down payment assistance programs? Is that allowable uses of the money? And then to who we might talk about with a housing issue with Aspen. I spent a lot of time when I had Paul's job talking to other destinations that had seasonal fluctuations in their economy. And I think it was Aspen that was actually out. They did a lot of subsidized housing. They built housing for their employees, but then they aged in place and they weren't leaving that housing. So they were literally buying housing in Florida and convincing the retirees to move off the mountain and go to a climate that was going to be better for them. Because it's not good to live a mile high when you're 70 something. So I don't know. I think that we should talk to Aspen. Are there other things that we can do? Is that even allowable? But I think we have to come up with the both ends of the age spectrum when we get specific about housing. As well as people in the middle.
I'm pretty sure I have your job, but yeah. But what you're suggesting here, I think, is a good format for a potential way the committee could move, which is categorizing this sort of housing layer cake and then maybe we hear from people on the outside, some of the input, and maybe we just throw ideas into those categories. And then we can look for best practices associated with individual ideas, and we can look for whether the qualifying aspects of those ideas for ARPA funding. And that might allow us to put everything out there but then begin to narrow the discussion as we move through the process. Dorothy.
Oh, actually, I think Lisa was first.
Oh, Lisa.
So I know we're not at like idea generation at this point, but I do think Wendy's point is a good one about looking elsewhere as well as part of this process. And I've been like hot on this program in Vail about deed restrictions. They have a goal of 1,000 deed restricted homes to maintain kind of the year-round long-term workforce. And I just think that there's some really good ideas out there that, and I know time is of the essence, but we have a lot of brilliant people here on Cape Cod, but there's brilliant people elsewhere as well.
Right.
That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, good point, Lisa. I think the balance here will be, sometimes you find these programs, and we don't want to get too focused where people think that there's one silver bullet to solve the problem. So we're gonna have to balance that going forward. But I could see where we might ask people to participate from Vail, Aspen, and give us sort of a rundown of some of those programs. So this is all really good input as we head into the next phase of what we're gonna do. Dorothy.
So I did remember the other point, and one of the things, I guess, at the end of the day, I'm wondering two things. One is, how will this tie into the commission's housing study, and what's the time frame relative to that? Because the commission plays such a critical role in terms of data gathering and analysis, and I'm keenly interested in learning from them about their, results of the housing study. That was one point. And the second is, I overheard a former senator earlier today talking about the fact that, first of all, let me just make the point. We have a monoculture of housing, as we know, single family residential, and we don't have enough units to solve the problem. And Paul, you talked about the market rate issues here. The market cannot at this time accommodate the housing needs that we have. So one might say we need to build our way out of this issue. And you mentioned zoning as one thing, and I'm not going to attribute this comment, but verticality is an important question that needs to be begged, because if you think about wastewater, if you think about all of the issues that are affecting our ecology, and you think about the sheer numbers and you pencil it for a developer, we know that density is critical. And what I don't know is if that density is achievable in a way that is reflective of our sensitivity to our environment, A, and B, doable in terms of the production of a sufficient number of units. So I know that factors into the zoning piece as well, but I just kind of wanted to throw out those thoughts. Thank you.
Those are great thoughts, Dorothy. And I see Christy's on the line, so I'll let her respond. But I would say, just from a process perspective, if we create these sort of categories of housing we're going to look at, if we intake these ideas, if we look at their viability to be funded through ARPA funds, and we look at best practices, there's still going to be information gaps. I think in some of these we're going to run into things that we don't know. And I think that's where the commission's housing study will be really important. And that housing study was part of the recommendation we made 2 weeks ago. So we're hopeful that can be acted on next week, and that work can begin or continue. So I don't know, Christy, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think, Paul, you're spot on there, in that hopefully we will identify where there are some gaps. And currently we're actually updating some of the needs analysis numbers. So that should help us set that baseline to then develop the strategies. So I think that the work that you're doing now to identify potential projects too could be part of that implementation phase. So we're anxious to get going on the housing strategy itself, but we are currently already working on updating those gap numbers. And just quickly to comment on Lisa's point about working with the community of Vail, we actually have George Ruther from Vail coming to our One Cape Summit to talk about their Indeed program. So that's an opportunity. It's coming up quickly. So if that's a place where people wanted to have a more discreet conversation with him, that might make some sense too. So.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Christy. And, Dorothy did manage the mention the connection between wastewater and housing. And as part of my discussion with both the commissioners and the assembly, that issue came up. And it's really 20 plus years of work regionally that have put us in the position on wastewater that we're in, where, especially if some of the things break the way that they might break from a state budget perspective, the least expensive place to build a sewer system in the Commonwealth could be Cape Cod. And if you'd said that 10 years ago, people would have laughed in your face. But with all the IIJA money and the federal programs out there, we are in a unique position to ride that wave to solve our biggest issue because of all the work that's been done for a couple of decades now in that regard. And so I'm hopeful that we can sort of channel that and then tie that directly to issues of density that could help us even out some of the housing market situation. Karen.
I definitely think. There we go. Is that better?
Yes.
No.
You're all set. I muted you. You're all set now.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I think we're saying all the same thing. The relationship with the regional housing study, and I know we're here to talk about the use of the ARPA funding, but I wonder if we have a role to go beyond that and really think about what on a very long-term strategy, because we've talked about some innovative ideas that really could do some wonderful things within our community and within the county and be trendsetters and really work on sustainability. Do we have a role here to think strategically, even if it's just to put it out there and get it on the table? And
I think that is an excellent point. So as we go through the process, I think I would envision that some of our report back to the commissioners would be, these are the specific ARPA funded projects we think you should look at based on the timeline. But I think we would be actually doing them an injustice not to put that in the larger context of the housing problem and the potential solutions to those problems or actions that can be taken. And I think that larger context really reflects Dan's sense of a roadmap. So I don't think that we would be precluded from doing that. So I think that's a really good point. Kristen.
So I don't know if this is beyond the scope of what we're working on right now or the committee's responsibility, and maybe this is something that would be integrated into the commission study, but I also feel if we're going down that path for us to identify potential partners as we're identifying strategy, because from my naive perspective, I'm not a housing expert, but I think what we seem to be missing as a community is this regional approach. And so if we're creating a regional approach, identifying those partners where we can really build some public-private partnerships, there's lots of really great things happening in the community, but there hasn't been that opportunity to bring all of those partners together and be really thoughtful and strategic about how we roll this out as a region. So if there's an opportunity for us, not assuming that, if we're naming partners, that they're going to be the ones to take it on. But I also feel if I don't identify potential opportunities for partnerships in this process, then no one's going to own it. And we're just throwing out a bunch of strategies that aren't going to move forward because no one's taking that ownership. So again, might be beyond what we're trying to do here, but something to integrate down the line, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I don't think it's beyond the scope of what we've been asked to do. And in fact, I think part of, coming up with a list of strategic partners associated with some of our recommendations, I think will be essential, because one of the things we might find is that there isn't a regional entity that can carry out some of the things that we think might help. And so identifying gaps or missing strategic partners can only be done if we list the strategic partners. So I think that's a great point. Thank you, Kristen. Dorothy.
Oh, and Paul, that's exactly the point I was going to make. So I'm glad you made it. And even better, we discussed this last time, and I think Kristen's point is excellent, which is by identifying who the partners are, you also identify the fact that there isn't a regional entity. And to Dan's point about roadmap, and Paul, you said we'd be doing them a disservice if we didn't lay out a roadmap. The idea of sustainably carrying this on will require a degree of coordination that doesn't exist structurally right now. So anyway, what you just said.
Excellent. Thank you. So,
Hey, Paul,
yes, Dan.
if you want to feel like we don't have a problem, I just couldn't help but go on Zillow and look at Vail. And the two top listings come in at 39.9 million and 19.8 million. Actually, our housing by that standard is affordable. If you really want to blow your mind, Zillow Vail and look at what stuff's for sale at.
Yes. Good. Very, very good point. Which one are you interested in, Dan? Dorothy. Oh, Wendy.
No, I just needed to lower my hand.
So, yeah, so to be more specific again, talking about, Kristen's making a good point about regional viewpoint. I've seen a choke point in the town of Barnstable where people, contractors have said they need help with the qualifying of tenants with some of these programs. Like they can build it, they can market it, but they don't always have that last step of adequately screening for eligibility. So that's something I think the county could do on a countywide basis quite easily, or we could fund that and just gonna get that granular thing in.
Great. Well, this has been a very useful discussion that will help us structure the upcoming meetings. And it gets our collective brains sort of thinking about how to proceed with such an enormous task. And that's just the housing side. So the other issue that we have to take a look at is water quality. I mentioned the wastewater issue and its nexus with the housing issue. So I think it's appropriate that they have been ranked number 1 and number 2 as regional challenges. But I also think that there's been a lot of regional leadership on wastewater that has put us into the position that we are now. We have a lot of towns that are moving forward, and we are getting ready to ride that wave on the wastewater side. I think we made the motion and recommendation to the commissioners last week that I think has been well received by both the commissioners and the assembly as it relates to the condition of fresh water. I don't think we should ever lose sight of the fact that the biggest threat to water quality on the Cape are single family homes. So this is something that we need to take a look at. But the county, if you look at the Water Protection Trust Fund, which was amazing, which the commission is staffing that right now, the septic loan program that's out there, that's been modified to allow people to use it for hookups to sewer systems. If you take a look at the lab and the potential of maybe water quality testing on the lab, or if you take into account the test facility for innovative alternative systems at the base, and then if you lump the dredge into that, you've got a bunch of disparate currently sort of programs at the county that are water quality based programs. So I think looking at that issue, assessing the threats, identifying the threats, looking at the solutions that are possible there, and potentially, you know, a role for the county there, at least from my perspective, is easier to see than on the housing issue. So I think we need to think in those terms, you know, water quality, saltwater environment, freshwater environment, drinking water. You know, 3 areas that we have to take a look at that I think will inform the housing discussion in a way that hopefully tailors it and make sure that any sort of suggested changes, any changes we might suggest in zoning are consistent with protecting water quality as well as community character. Karen.
When we get to the wastewater conversation, is there any information that we should review relative to like the septic loan program and what's worked, what hasn't worked, how it should be modified? Because that may be a little bit of low-lying fruit in some of this.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Again, as we structure the water quality meeting, maybe we have a housing layer cake that's based on issues. Maybe on the water quality side, we would have the similar issues, you know, saltwater, freshwater, drinking water, but then look specifically at some of the county programs. So sort of a summary of those county programs would be a great way to start that discussion also.
What's worked, what?
Yes. Excellent. All right. Well, is there any other questions or input from any members of the committee? I think this has been a really necessary and productive conversation because it will help us set up the process for dealing with these 2 big issues that are coming up. Hopefully in a way that we can get through it as efficiently as possible and provide some really useful information to commissioners with some perspective. So with that, we really have come to the close of our agenda today. And I think we're in pretty good shape. So if there are no additional questions, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Wendy makes the motion to adjourn.
Second.
We do not need a second, but Dan would second it if we did.
I retract my second.
So we will take a roll call on the adjournment and we will conclude business this morning. Karen Gardner. Dorothy Savarez.
Aye.
John Gonzalez.
Aye.
Lisa Guyon.
Aye.
Dan Wolf.
Aye.
Wendy Northcross.
Aye.
Kristen O'Malley.
Aye.
Thank you all. We will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
2 weeks?
Oh,
Not
1
next
week.
week.
1 week.
A reminder, please.
1
Yes.
week.
Next
Yes.
week, save the date, Thursday at 11, right, Robin? The housing drill down meeting. And the 28th, the following Thursday, 11 o'clock, the water quality drill down meeting.
Right.
So we'll see you next week.
Both
you.
at 11.
At
Beg your
11.
pardon?
Both at 11.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Aye.